In this video, I'll show you some ways of working that will help you map themes in qualitative analysis. And these are rich pictures, mind maps, and the visual language of non-linear line.
I'm mapping basic topics of conversation.
Completely different pictures.
Now, remember how in video 3 we were talking about how qualitative research is about generating new theory. It's not about testing existing theory. In qualitative research, what we're doing is looking for different ways to understand the world, and that immediately creates the conditions for social change. Quantitative research starts with what we already know and then checks to see if that's any good. And in qualitative work, we're not seeking confirmation of what we already know, we're actively looking for alternative ways of knowing. And that's why change is typically more in the foreground in qualitative work than in quantitative work. And that's the context for our first tool, rich pictures.
We're on a mapping survey near the Cardassia sector.
So rich pictures are a feature of soft systems methodology, which is focused on understanding complex social problems and then creating change to fix those problems. I've got a handbook on soft systems methodology that I've posted up on Moodle if you want to find out more about it, but you don't need to know about it for assessment 1. Now, one part of the soft systems methodology is the creation of the rich picture. I actually call them messy pictures. You'll see me referring to these as messy pictures because the best ones are messy. Now, these are tools that are used to capture the complexity of social problems or social situations, and visual representation is often a better way of capturing complexity. These pictures look messy in 3 different ways. First, they contain many elements and are complex. Second, they typically don't use straight lines and boxes. They're not neat and tidy in that sense, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And 3, they're typically not made by artists. They're made by people who may not have had any training in art and not much of a talent for drawing. Now, you've got 2 terms you can use to search out for some examples of rich pictures. So use the term rich picture. Few people refer to them as messy pictures. It's only me, I think, who calls them messy pictures. So you've got the first search term, rich picture, and combine that with the search term soft systems methodology. So I want you to go and have a search for some of these pictures. Use Google search for this or any other public web search engine. And what I want you to do is have a look through the search results and see how some of the pictures are nice and neat looking with straight lines and everything in nice boxes. Well, those aren't messy enough for us. Your map needs to be like the messy ones. So have a look at the messy ones. They're not messy as in no one can understand what the heck is going on. The meaning is still clear, but messy in the sense of using a visual language that communicates complexity, instability, and fluidity. And we'll talk about that after I tell you about the second tool, which is mind maps.
Completely different pictures.
Some of you might already be familiar with the term mind map, and that's because it's been used in education a lot as a thing that can help students study. And the term is often credited to a guy called Tony Buzan, who wrote a book called The Mind Map Book in 1984. What is a mind map? Well, it's supposed to be a visual representation of how your brain sorts information. But this isn't a unit on neuropsychology, so we're not going to get into arguments about how the brain works, except to acknowledge that the brain is very, very complicated. And that's why mind maps look messy. Typically, a mind map will have at its center the thing you're trying to understand or explain, and connected to that are a series of keywords that are associated with it. And mind maps are always incomplete in the sense that the act of drawing a mind map creates new ways of understanding the thing you're trying to understand. So it's constantly morphing and changing as you add new things to it. The best mind maps look as though the person who made them didn't use a ruler. They look wiggly and a bit wobbly. Now, mind maps are very popular, particularly in education, but also in areas of management, because they're a very good tool for project planning, the thing we'll talk about in weeks 11 and 12. So we might return to the mind map then. But they are popular, and lots of folk have published lots and lots of stuff on how to make a mind map. And a lot of that stuff is free to access on the web. So you can find lots of stuff with a simple search of the web. Just search for mind maps, how to make a mind map, and don't go for the paid stuff. There's no magic sauce here. The free stuff is as good as the paid stuff. Now, what's the connection between rich pictures, or messy pictures, as I like to call them, rich pictures and mind maps?
I'm mapping basic topics of conversation.
So, rich pictures and mind maps, they're both visual. They are visual because they both seek to capture complexity. And a key way of capturing complexity is through using visual images rather than words. So these sorts of maps, they may contain words, but not many words. And typically they don't contain prose, as in sentences. They might contain short phrases, typically aphorisms, short, pithy sayings. But the key thing is that they're image-based. They're not word-based. The other element of rich pictures and mind maps is that they're produced with the purpose of creating new understanding. They're not intended to capture or produce something static. They're intended to be fluid rather than fixed. And if you add something to one of these maps, it should cause a kind of ripple effect so that everything on the map wobbles, particularly the case for mind maps. They're supposed to be changing, constantly changing. That's why neat pictures are no good for us here. Those neat pictures with straight lines and everything in a nice little box, all nice and tidy. They're no good for us. You don't want that aesthetic. You want something to look like it would ripple and wobble if you added something to it, and also would be flexible, rather than break and fall apart if you added more stuff to it. They need to feel bouncy. Need to be a bouncy picture rather than a rigid picture. And that's because both rich pictures and mind maps are focused on change, on helping us to think about a thing in a different way. And they're meant to capture complexity in a way that's accessible. And they're meant to help us think creatively and to engage our curiosity rather than be confirmatory or give us a sense of certainty. And they're supposed to capture the big picture, be holistic rather than reductionist. And also capture the whole of a thing rather than just part of a thing. And it's exactly what qualitative work is all about: curiosity, creativity, big picture stuff. Now, there is organization in these maps. They're not random collections of things. The components of the map are connected to reflect complexity and fluidity rather than simplicity and rigidity. And again, that's what I mean by messy. Messy but organized, messy but comprehensible. What's needed is something that is both messy and clear at the same time. And you'll see that in the marking rubric for assessment 1, for the visualization component. You get an HD when you effectively or exceptionally balance messiness with clarity. It's not easy, but that's why it's HD. Have a go. You might surprise yourself. Now, how do you achieve that? Because it is a tough job. Well, this gets onto our final tool in the toolbox, the non-linear line. And that's the other bit of the marking criteria for the visualization bit. Uses non-linear lines and connections. I've already been talking about this in this video, but I haven't really named it. So let's name it properly now and focus on it so you can fully understand it.
Oh, why must I feed him straight lines?
So your map will be a drawing, and it will most likely be a line drawing. It may or may not have color, but it will need to have lines. But the lines need to be non-linear. What, non-linear? You mean no lines? No. Linear refers to a particular type of line. It refers to a straight line, or a nearly straight line. So the lines in your map must not be straight or even nearly straight. They need to wiggle and be curvy. Linear also means something going in one direction, a thing that progresses from A to B and then straight to C, a single series of steps in a sequence that goes in only one direction. So if you put an arrowhead at the end of a connecting line, you'd want to have an arrowhead at the other end pointing in the opposite direction, so that it's not only non-linear, as in not being a straight line, but it's also non-linear as in not in one direction. And I'm not talking about Harry Styles. Okay, I'm not talking about that one direction, I'm talking about this one direction. Okay, that's not a dated reference, is it? 2010. Jesus. Okay, I'm getting old. Now, why avoid straight lines? Well, this is about visual language and understanding what a straight line communicates. Straight lines are the visual equivalent of saying that something is certain, solid, consistent, unwavering, and predictable. It also indicates expediency, a straight line from A to B. Having a container with straight lines around something is the equivalent of saying this thing inside is controlled, it's contained, it's stable, it's known, and it's static. It's not coming out of there. Right? Wavy lines are the visual language equivalent of words like soft and inconsistent, fluid and unpredictable. It suggests, these wavy lines suggest complexity and uncertainty. It's wavy lines that reflect qualitative findings, but also qualitative research processes. That's because, as we talked about in video 3, we're not driven by theory, but by uncertainty. We're searching for things we don't know. We're not testing the things that we do know. So we need to loosen up our assumptions and our preconceptions so that we can find new ways of thinking. And that's how you generate theory. And if you have a nice, neat little diagram or picture, and it looks all finished and polished, there's a tendency not to want to mess with it, or change it. Hey, it's perfect. So having messy pictures means you won't have such problems messing around with it, moving things around, changing things around. You don't worry about making a mess because it's already a mess. Now, how do you create your glorious mess of a map? I'll tell you.
Completely different pictures.
So with both rich pictures and mind maps, you can create them by hand. If you choose to do that, you just need to take a photo of it with your phone. And when you finished it, paste that photo into your Word document for submission. You can't submit it separately as an image file. It has to be embedded in your Word document. You can also create your map with a computer app. I've recommended you use Smart Art Graphics in MS Word, simply because that should be something you'll have easy access to as you're writing the written component of assessment 1. You can just add the graphics in quite easily. But you can also use other programs, PowerPoint, Google Slides, that allows you to import images and create maps. You could use graphics programs. There are lots of free ones out there. And there are also some specific apps for creating mind maps. But be careful with all of these apps. Some of them encourage you to use straight lines or make it difficult for you to use curvy lines. And that's not good for assessment 1. Remember, curvy lines, not straight lines. It is kind of interesting, though, that most computer apps make it easier to create a straight line rather than a wiggly line. And that's because it's simpler to code the operation of making a straight line. It's a lot easier. The maths is a lot easier. So if you're using a computer app, you just have to work a little bit harder to get your lines to wiggle. That's all. But I'm sure you'll get there. When you draw by hand, it's easier to draw a wiggly line. It's actually easier to draw a wiggly line than a straight line, especially after a few gin and tonics. But the benefit of using a computer app is that it's often faster. You can correct your image easier, and you can import other images into it, like images from the web. You know, if you're feeling really insecure about your ability to draw, then you can just use drawings available from the web. But do make sure you only use images that are not copyright protected. In Google, you can do this by clicking on the Tools button under the search box, and you click on Usage Rights, and then click on Creative Commons licenses, and then you only see images that are copyright free in terms of they're free to use. But do check with each image. Sometimes the creator of the image wants acknowledgement, wants a little thank you, in which case you'd put a reference in. And the way to reference, it's using APA citation style. So you should be familiar with your APA style guide by now for psychology, American Psychological Association style guide. So there's a particular style of referencing for using clip art and stock images, and I've included a handy little website that summarizes that part of the APA style guide for how to cite and reference clip art images. And yeah, if you're using something you have to cite, you do need to include a reference at the end of your piece of written work. But that's not included in the word count. Anyway, let's get on. Let's get on to that written bit. We're going to get onto that actually in week 2. In week 2, we're going to talk about that written bit. That's where you draw out the differences between qualitative and quantitative inquiry. You know, you talk about how different it is creating an image representing qualitative inquiry as it is to when you're creating an image for quantitative inquiry. You know, the bar charts and the graphs and the tables that you do with quantitative work. Now, those differences between qualitative and quantitative, they're highlighted by this process of drawing a map. You should have an understanding of some of these differences by now. If you've been listening carefully, you'll have picked up quite a few just from this video. But there's something else that can help you. I've not set it as a required reading, so it's optional for you, but I do really think you'd benefit from it, so I recommend it. It's reading chapter 2 of our prescribed text, because that will more fully flesh out those differences between qualitative and quantitative inquiry to help you write that part of assessment 1. But we'll talk more about that in week 2. And I'm going to crack on with my recordings for week 2. Now, they're going to be audio recordings, not video, because by week 2, you need to be doing your own visualizing, and having audio rather than video, I think, will help you paint your own pictures, because in week 2, I ain't painting your pictures for you, okay? I'm not going to mess up your messy pictures. Okay, so till then, ta-da.